Praveen will be moderating tonight's panel with our amazing, brilliant, and fierce honorees. And I know that many of you are standing, so I promise that we will try to keep it tight. So with that, I'm extremely excited to bring our 2018 CAC at 10 honorees to the stage. We have chosen a group of 3 extraordinary women who represent the text, history, and values of the Constitution to which CAC is dedicated. The Honorable Loretta E. Lynch served as the 83rd Attorney General of the United States under President Barack Obama. Remember those days? And was the first female African-American Attorney General in U.S. history. Throughout her career, she has been aggressively battling terrorism, financial fraud, cybercrime, and defending human and civil rights. She is responsible for improving the relationship between local law enforcement and the communities they serve, a cause that is so incredibly important to this day. As Attorney General, Ms. Lynch took strong and principled positions on contested legal issues that advanced equality, challenged discrimination, and championed civil rights and criminal justice reform. We are so proud to honor her as a champion of the Constitution. Attorney General Lynch, would you please come up to this? So just a plug, our award was created by a local artisan woodworker, so we're keeping the DC economy strong. Okay, our second honoree tonight, Shirley Ann Higuchi, the daughter of Japanese-Americans incarcerated during World War II, helped to establish the Interpretive Center at Heart Mountain in 2011, a world-class museum dedicated to passing on the Heart Mountain story to future generations. This interactive museum provides an overview of the wartime relocation of Japanese Americans, including the background history of anti-Asian prejudice in America and the factors leading to their forced relocation and confinement. In addition to her work at Heart Mountain, Ms. Higuchi serves as an advisory board member of the National Consortium on Racial and Ethnic Fairness in Courts and has spoken out on the dangers of for-profit detention centers and racism in America, and has served on the Federal Law Enforcement Nomination Commission since her appointment by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Ms. Higuchi's work shows her commitment to elucidating our nation's history, even, and I think importantly, the darkest chapters of that history, to provide a powerful reminder to all Americans of our painful past and an opportunity to reflect on how discrimination continues to live in our law, policy, and communities. We are so proud and delighted to honor her as a champion of the Constitution. Ms. Higuchi, please join us. And finally, last but certainly not least, Brittany Packnett is an award-winning national leader who has committed her life and career to fighting for justice. She is Teach for America's Vice President of National Community Alliances, was an appointed member of the Ferguson Commission, served on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and is an advisory board member of Rise to Run, an organization committed to encouraging grassroots, diverse, progressive women to run for office. In addition to all of that, Ms. Packnett also co-founded Campaign Zero, a crucial policy platform to end police violence. Ms. Packnett was recently honored at the 2018 BET Awards as one of the fiercest activists of our time and continues to advocate for urgent systemic change through national and international media. As an education policy advocate and activist for racial and social equity, Ms. Packnett's visionary leadership is driving social change in communities across America, and her commitment to justice has inspired and empowered millions of Americans, ensuring that constitutional values are part of people's lived experience. We are so proud to honor her as a champion of the Constitution. values for the work that they do every day, that they have done and continue to do to bring to life the text, history, and values of the Constitution. One more round of applause for all three of them. And so I'm now going to hand this off to Praveen to moderate our panel discussion.
So I don't know whether you remember the Oldsmobile, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile" campaign. Hopefully some of you are old enough to remember that. But this is not your father's progressive originalism panel. This is not that kind of originalism panel. I think that if that campaign was about remaking what you thought about the product, but also remaking who you saw in it, I think that's sort of CAC's task, to get you to rethink the product, the Constitution, but also who cloaks themselves in the mantle of the Constitution. And with that, I'm going to pinch myself because I'm lucky enough to sort of have this conversation with all of you. I'm going to start with Ms. Wydra. I'm going to give everyone titles so that they're symmetrical. Tell us, CAC's methodology has lots of references to respecting and fidelity to the whole text and history and values of the Constitution. What are you referencing when you say whole text, history, and values, and why is that significant?
So thank you so much, Praveen. Sorry, Mr. Fernandes. Lots of us, when we hear people invoke the Constitution, it's because some conservative is trying to justify limited government or something. And when they talk about the Constitution, they kind of keep it at 1789. And while that was an extraordinary initial start to democracy, importantly, there were a lot of problems with the Constitution as it stood at the end of the 18th century. Many of us, probably everyone on this panel, was excluded from the promise of the constitutional democracy and rights that were enshrined originally in our Constitution. But fortunately, the drafters of the Constitution put in the amendment process. And we, the people, over time, have fought for our own equal dignity, have fought for our rights and freedoms, and we were able to amend the Constitution through crucial amendments, especially after the Civil War, which CAC focuses so much of its litigation and scholarship on, where finally the principles of the Declaration of Independence were written into the Constitution for all people. Of course, it took some more amendments and a lot more policy work and social movements to make those sweeping promises of equality a reality. But if you look at the whole Constitution, its arc of progress from 1789 to the present, you see that the text, history, and values of that document support progressive outcomes, support progressive policies. You see that the drafters of the 14th Amendment were the first originators of affirmative action policies. You see that they wanted to ensure that people were able to have families of their own choosing when they wanted them after the horrors of the institution of slavery. So if you actually look closely at the whole Constitution, you don't just forget that everything after 1789 happened. It is an inherently progressive document, and we as progressives should ground ourselves in it, should cloak ourselves in it, should demand the justice that we are promised in it when we advocate for our rights.
Woo! Woo! Yeah. Well, that could not be a better transition to Attorney General Lynch. One of the tenets of progressive originalism, or new textualism, if you prefer that term, is that the subjective intent of the framers or drafters is not as important as the public meaning of words. So in other words, it doesn't mean as much who a subjective drafter or legislator thinks of in their mind when they're drafting a provision as being protected by provision of the public meaning of words. And you had just such a moment when you were Attorney General of the United States and faced North Carolina's horrible and anti-discriminatory, anti-trans bigotry too. And you were forced to look at our nation's anti-discrimination laws, its sex discrimination laws, and apply that. Can you talk about your decision-making process and what that was like?
Sure. There's some people in the Department of Justice who say one of the first times they saw me get visibly angry over something, because they didn't tend to see that. But it was sort of a painful moment for me to watch my home state take such a turn back, not just in time, but in thinking. I will say that it was not a total surprise. I mean, I think those of us who are talking about the challenges of the present day know very well that this backlash we're living in now really began during the Obama administration, when we were, in fact, making policy that we felt was completely consistent with the Constitution. One of North Carolina's largest cities, Charlotte, had passed an anti-discrimination statute, which really should not be a controversial thing. A law that says that we do not support discrimination in any form is typically seen as being consistent with the values of this country and of that state and of most people. And as part of a series of political trades that got made in the state, a state that has frankly gone from being one of the more progressive in the Upper South to being one of the most retrograde, sadly, the new administration in the state at that time passed a bill saying that really no city could pass an anti-discrimination ordinance. That was the first part of it that caught our attention at the Department of Justice. And they also added on to it what was known as the bathroom bill, which basically literally said that individuals had to use the bathroom that corresponded to their sex assignment at birth, which of course means that transgender individuals who have come to know who they truly are and have found their identity, which may not correspond with that on their birth certificate, and probably does not for most people, unless they've changed it, would have to, in fact, use a bathroom separate from their identity, how they present, really how they're living their lives. Which I always thought was for a group of people who the Republican Party tends to pride itself on small government, being out of people's personal lives. I thought it was one of the most intrusive statutes I'd ever seen. To literally legislate how people handle one of the most private functions in life that harms no one. And to cloak it in a law enforcement imprimatur and say that it was done for the protection of people who might also be in the restroom with a transgender person, the theory being that the transgender person would be a threat to them. We looked at this statute, we looked at it in the context of current legislation, but we also did look at it in the context of what is the meaning of anti-discrimination legislation writ large. And it is for us, it was for us, very much the view that even if the Constitution does not literally say transgender individuals, it did not literally talk about African Americans except to make us a fraction of a human being. And yet we all know that not only the meaning but the jurisprudence covers the ideal of equality for everyone who has been marginalized. So for us, we thought that it was not only consistent with the Constitution, but also with the current anti-discrimination laws that were on the books. There were some things pending in the Seventh Circuit that we were waiting on, but we felt that we really could not wait. After trying to negotiate with the state of North Carolina, we said to them, look, we're happy to talk to you. We'll talk about this. We gave them notice, as was required by law, that you are in violation of federal laws, and here is how. And we were very, very sure in our legal analysis. And we said, you have a week to comply. You can either enjoin this and certify that you will not be enforcing this law, or if you want an extension, you can have that. And their response was to bring a lawsuit against us. So at that point, my response was to say, that is clearly an end to the negotiation point. That was an answer, and there really was no point in going back to the table. We had been very clear that we thought we had strong legal ground to advance the rights of all individuals, of all North Carolinians, of all transgender individuals, of all people who sought to just simply live their lives with dignity and peace. And so we instituted our lawsuit about a week after we started those negotiations as well. It was something that we had a lot of conversation about it internally, but no difference of opinion, I can tell you that. And of course, people within the state were reaching out to us. The university system was very concerned about possibly losing funding. The law enforcement entities within the state were very concerned about possibly losing funding. But we made it clear that that was a very real possibility. Because if we, as a Department of Justice, have as one of our primary missions making sure that everyone is accountable under the law, when one of our states chooses to literally step out of the constitutional imprimatur of what is not just right, not just moral, but legal, they have to be held accountable as well.
Well, you've clearly laid out the legal bases, and you did that so well. But you also had a different component. Besides your advocacy, you held an extraordinary press conference along with the then head of Civil Rights Division, Brittany Packnett, where you not only laid out exactly where the case was and the sort of situation that had arose into it, but you also placed it in a historical context, both in the history of the Civil Rights Movement, but also made it very personal as your connection as a North Carolinian. And I'm curious about your thoughts as lawyer, as educator, your sort of role as sort of, laying out that context. How important do you find that context to be?
I thought it was vital that we lay out the context, because to me this was an affront to transgender individuals, certainly, and it was something that was going to put them literally in harm's way. But it also was a turning away from the very concept of equality and inclusion that I think the Constitution is grounded in. And as Liz has said so powerfully, not just today, but in your advocacy, the Constitution is really aspirational. It really seeks to define us as we hope to be. It talks about the best that we can be, not as we truly are. I think the founders recognized that we were frail, that we were fragile, and that we would need help in making sure we lived up to what were very, very lofty ideals. So to me, it's always been about making sure that we are the best that we can be. And so when we've seen people stray from that, usually out of fear, whenever there has been great progress along those lines, we have seen a backlash. We certainly saw it after the Civil War and after Reconstruction with the harsh Jim Crow laws that were instituted. That had a legal basis because people were able to control the courts and uphold them. We saw it with the backlash after Brown v. Board of Education, when courts upheld every possible argument to avoid living up to the law of the land. And we certainly saw it with states' actions against LGBTQ friends and family, with bans on same-sex marriages, with supporting individuals, with striking down anti-discrimination statutes. So we've always seen historically this backlash to progress, which I think is human. I really think it is a human response to it, but it's not our best response. It's not the best of us, and it's not what our Constitution calls for us to do. So for me, it was important to place this fight in that context, to remind people that we have been down this road before. We've picked the wrong door. We've picked the wrong door and tried to slam it in people's faces before, and we have always lived to regret it. We've always seen that when we limit someone else's freedom, we are slicing our own in half. And that the person that we think we are limiting now will be us tomorrow. So it has happened time and time again. So it was very important for me to place it in that historical context. And North Carolina, certainly as a state of the South, has been through that cycle many, many times.
You're doing my work for me. Because that's the perfect segue. I mean, the context and history is so core to the work that you do, Ms. Higuchi, with the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation. And so could you tell us a little bit about that project and about the role and how Heart Mountain educates the public about the experience of internment for Japanese Americans in the context of World War II?
Thank you. I hope this is on. Okay. Excellent answer. And Jim, I was like, Liz was like, wow, you really nailed that. So then I was thinking about my story and like what I'm going to say. But I think that we've learned in our society that certain groups of people are shunned and shamed into being quiet. And the issue with respect to the Japanese-American incarceration is my parents, who were American citizens, by the way, along with many, many other people, were shamed into keeping quiet. That's why I didn't learn about this when I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I knew nothing. But 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent, 2/3 of which were American citizens, were literally rounded up and placed in remote areas and camps. And my parents were one of them, and that's where they met. So the history is important to tell because history has the ability to repeat itself, and I think we all know that. And because my community have been shunned and shamed into keeping quiet, that has risen to the level where I have to shout, at the mountaintops in terms of getting this story out. So it was really a band of individuals committed in Wyoming, a Republican state. We have really good people in Wyoming. And with the Japanese Americans, who were mostly based at this point in California, they came together as a small band of individuals and built an interpretive center that stands at the site where my parents met as children and were incarcerated. And my parents were, one was born in San Jose, California, the other one in San Francisco, city girl. And but for that incarceration, I wouldn't be talking to you. But if I was there at that time, I would have been put in the camp. It doesn't make a difference whether I was a 3rd or 4th generation Japanese American and DC bar president and invited here to speak with you. I would have been rounded up and put in a camp. So my goal with my group is to tell that story so it's not repeated to anyone ever again.
So you sort of hinted at this. So Heart Mountain, aside from its amazing work to sort of elucidate the past, it's used the past to elucidate the present as well. And so can you talk to me a little bit about the important work that you all are doing to sort of tie the history to present crises? I know that Heart Mountain has talked about the use of private prisons to incarcerate immigrants, but has also looked at such contemporary issues and controversies, such as the sort of acceptance of national security, sort of flimsy ruses and conversations by the federal government to support discriminatory policies like the Muslim ban. And so can you talk a little bit about the contemporary work and the art of analogizing that Heart Mountain does?
Well, the Japanese American community, specifically through the Japanese American Citizens League that was very present during the incarceration during World War II, has really stepped up to the plate on issues of for-profit detention centers, housing children and families and individuals that shouldn't be in those prison centers. Ironically, in Wyoming, right in our own backyard where our museum stands, there is a for-profit prison being built right now. And it's very disturbing, not only to the Wyoming residents, but also to my community with Heart Mountain, that this is actually happening in the very state where this occurred 76 years ago. So we feel that what happened 76 years ago to the Japanese Americans can happen again. And I think we're seeing it through the Muslim ban, where people are literally being discriminated against, not for what they've done, but who they look like, how they appear, and essentially where they're from. And so the parallels are very obvious, and I think learning from what happened 76 years ago with a very strong message of what, it's so obviously wrong, you know what I mean? That using that is a way to prevent harm, I believe, to future individuals could be faced with the same type of conflict. So our job is to tell the story over and over again, so our legislators and individuals in power will think twice before they do what they did 76 years ago. And I think we have that capacity, and I think we can do it.
So in grim circumstances, I think a lot of us take great courage and comfort from the notion that constitutional meaning and the law's meaning doesn't just lie in the domain or in the hands of courts and lawyers, but in fact that a lot of constitutional meaning is formed by the people and the public. And so while litigation certainly elucidates such principles as equal protection or due process or even unreasonable search and seizure, there are groups like Campaign Zero that in fact are doing the exact same thing, making those principles real in people's lived lives. Can you tell us about the sort of genesis of that work and how it came to be?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for this incredible honor, and it's such an honor to be sitting next to you all, to meet you, to see you again. And I also have to say, for the record, I believe women, and I wish the Senate would as well. Just had to put that out there, given the moment. I am a person who believes in the necessity of both protest and policy. I believe in what Dr. King called a creative tension, that if the people do not actually create the crisis, that the systems won't be forced to answer. And so when I stepped out onto the streets of Ferguson, 15 minutes from my home in Florissant, Missouri, on August the 10th, 2014, one day after Michael Brown Jr. had been killed by a Ferguson officer named Darren Wilson, I was clear on that commitment. I was clear on why we were there and why there were thousands of people who came out of their homes, who were never called or summoned by an organization, but called by their spirit, their love for one another, and their commitment to this country to take a stand and demand answers and justice. And so Campaign Zero was literally born out of the Ferguson uprising. 3 of our 4 original founders, we all met on the streets of Ferguson. And so Campaign Zero was born of tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets and ARAP vehicles and all of the things that we thought we couldn't see on American streets. Campaign Zero is born of Black people deciding to take our constitutional rights in our own hands, but as a result, we were treated as thugs instead of as patriots. And what we decided to do, a lot of people think it was an answer to the criticism that all we were was protesters and we didn't have the sophistication to have the policy conversation. It wasn't actually in response to that. I'm the child of two preachers. There are progressive people of faith in the world, right? We're here. I was taught very early that the word says to write the vision and make it plain. And so we said, we, the people, will write the vision. We don't have to wait on someone to tell us what the policy should be. Mama Cat knows how she should be treated in her community, right? Sarah knows how she should be treated in her own neighborhood. Kayla should know how she should be able to walk down the street and preserve her dignity in that moment. And so we decided to take that into our own hands and write the future that we wanted to see. We, the people, wrote the future, period. So Campaign Zero is not just the 4 of us who co-founded it. We were 4 people with laptops, and that was pretty much it. We're over 1,000 volunteers virtually who connect across the country, who do a great deal of research, press, reading, writing, and most importantly, engage in conversations with people who have lived this. So everyone from academics and researchers to folks who have endured police violence in their lives, we recognize that all of the good ideas that we need to move this country forward can come from all of those places. So we leverage those voices, we compressed them into 10 policy areas, and we said, we don't want you to ever have to pay a due or show up at a meeting for this to be useful to you. So we created a digital platform, and you can go to joincampaign0.org, download the policies in any of these 10 policy buckets, and walk up to your mayor, your city councilor, your governor, and say, this is what I want to see become true in my community. So that is thus far, we've seen over 60 laws passed that include at least 2 Campaign Zero buckets or more. We've also seen great changes to the Austin City Police Union contract because activists in Austin used our materials. We've seen the most restrictive use of force policy in the country be adopted in Baton Rouge, Louisiana after the killing of Alton Sterling because of Campaign Zero policies. So I truly believe that the power lies with the people, and that's what Campaign Zero is all about.
So I've read the amazing policy solutions you have on the website, and I encourage everybody to do the same thing. But because it's not, this is a law and policy crowd, that's the currency we traffic in, But one of the things that I think is so powerful about your work, both with Campaign Zero and writ large, is the culture work you do as well, and gets a little bit less attention in DC. Could you talk about the culture work, aside from the policy solutions, the culture work?
So I want everyone to think of their favorite police or legal serial right now. If you're thinking of NCIS, that's the wrong answer. The best one is Law and Order. But if you really think about the images that you see portrayed on those screens, if you think about the ways in which it is perfectly natural for us to turn on those shows and see a police officer throwing someone up on the hood of a car or searching them and seizing their property without the proper paperwork, and then on top of that, never seeing those police officers be accountable, that creates certain beliefs and mindsets in this country. That tells us certain messages about certain people. It tells us that the cops are always good, right? And the people who go up against them are always bad and are never standing on anything valid. It tells us that Black and brown people are inherently violent and that they somehow deserve the kind of treatment that we see on these shows. I could go on, but the culture has helped create the position that we're in right now. So it would be a mistake to ignore culture as we create the solutions. There are plenty of times when it takes legislation and litigation to move the needle, but there are also many times when it's actually culture that changes the people, and then people who change the policy. And so we want to make sure that we're taking on both of those things as we do our work, both in Campaign Zero and, as you said, writ large. And we also want to make sure that we're changing the culture because it's important that we have a clear narrative, not just about police violence, but about how violence, period, especially state-sanctioned violence, manifests in this country. We have to make sure that we're not ignoring women and women of color in that conversation. We have to make sure that we're not ignoring LGBTQ plus individuals in that conversation, because there are unique ways in which all of that violence can manifest for those communities, and if we're not paying attention to that and having a cultural conversation about it, then we can't actually see policy shift in a way that includes all of us. So the policy work is just as critical, the culture work is just as critical as the policy work, because we are not just in the business of changing laws, but changing people's hearts and minds, so that when those people go out and push their representatives, push the courts, and make sure that we create a government that actually represents all of us, that those people are of a mind toward equity and equality.
So I could be here all evening just listening, honestly, and I would be a lucky, lucky person to do exactly that. But because somebody is going to ring the gong eventually for me, I will end with maybe a lightning round. It's been an incredibly grim week, no matter which issue you track, whether you're tracking immigration policies, pathways to citizenship, and one's socioeconomic status, the Mueller investigation, or certainly the bleak stage not only of judicial nominations, but how we deal with allegations of sexual violence in this country. And so you're deeply inspiring individuals. That's why you are honorees. So could you each give us something that you feel optimistic about before we so inspire us once again. Attorney General Lynch, I'll start with you.
I feel optimistic about the voice of women, the voice of marginalized women, the voice of victims, the voice of everyone who's being uplifted in the current debate, and who is looking at people who are brave enough to share their pain and coming forward as well, because that is how we change the perspective. That is how we build those issues into law and into policy, is by recognizing that law is the way in which we deal with our human interactions with one another. It's how we regulate society. It's how we all get along. And it is very, very personal, and it should be personal to people. So the people who need law the most, the victims, the marginalized people, women who have been under assault, literally and also as groups in this country, are raising their voices. And so that gives me great, great optimism that when the political wheel does turn, because it always turns, that we will have something to build on, and we will have something to use, and we will have not just the voices and the stories, but the thoughts and the hearts and minds to move forward and reclaim this country.
Woo!
I have 2 points that make me optimistic. One is my parents, when they were 11 years old, they were children, American citizens. And I must mention that my father's family had 14.25 acres in San Jose, California, which was Silicon Valley. So the property was held in 2 of my uncles' name because they were born in America, but my grandfather couldn't own it because he was an immigrant. They had laws preventing landowning for Japanese-Americans. But they were ripped from their homes, placed in a camp, and I'm sitting here. So there is a possibility to grow and survive and make it when your life gets ripped apart. And I think the other thing that I'm very optimistic about is we have a world-class museum in the middle of Wyoming, a red state. And we have the support of the local community, Senator Simpson, former Senator Simpson, and the entire congressional delegation. I can't explain it, but they really support us, as well as the Democratic Secretary Mineta, by the way, who was incarcerated at Hartmount with my parents. He was Commerce in Clinton administration, and he was also Secretary of Transportation in Bush. You know, there are good people out there, and I think when we start labeling people, you're a Republican, you're bad. You're a Democrat, you're good. You're a Democrat, you're bad. That's when we've already lost the war. There are good people everywhere, and I think our obligation is to go out and find them.
So I'll cheat as well, because I've got 2.
We need bonus inspiration.
So the first piece of inspiration for me is that this is truly, legitimately, not the worst it has ever been. And I come from people who survived far more. I say often my ancestors did far more with far less than I have now. So I have no excuse not to make it through. And if Harriet can do it, and Ida B. Wells can do it, and Shirley Chisholm can do it, and Loretta Lynch can do it, then I can do it. I'm very clear on that. But the second piece, I've been at Harvard for the last few weeks. I'm a fellow at their Institute of Politics, so I teach a study group every Tuesday night, not every night, good God. And I decided after listening to some folks on campus and in greater Boston about what they wanted, that our sessions would be on the future of social change. It would be on examining how we can all play a part. And I am up against the former head of the White House Correspondents Association and a former congressperson and the former head of the DNC. I'm like, nobody is coming to this little study group to talk about change. When I tell you that there were people sitting on the floors and hanging out in the hallways and trying to figure out how they could get in, because everybody is anxious to figure out what they can do to create the world that we all deserve. So the people give me hope. They will always give me hope. And if you're ever looking for hope, go and talk to somebody who's doing the work, even if they're not doing the work in the same way that you are. Ask them what keeps them going, and then try a little bit of what they got.
Woo! By all of that. So thank you so much to our honorees, and thank you to Praveen for doing a fabulous job moderating.